Just before the sun cracked the horizon, the glass doors of Pinewood Hospital slid open, casting a faint glow onto the hospital's quiet lobby. In stepped a boy, no more than 12, his clothes dusted with dirt and his face marked with exhaustion beyond his years. He moved carefully, cradling a baby wrapped in an old, tattered blanket as if protecting something precious. His grip on the tiny bundle was tight, his steps determined but weary. He looked over his shoulder more than once, casting glances that were both anxious and defiant, as if expecting someone, or something, to take away the fragile life he held so close to him. Nurse Emma was just starting her shift, flipping through her early morning checklists at the front desk. It was a routine she knew well, the steady rhythm of paperwork and coffee in the early hours. But this morning something felt different. She noticed the small figure at the door, and her attention shifted immediately. Her heart softened as she took in the sight, a young boy with tired, desperate eyes, holding a baby with an almost fierce protectiveness. Emma stepped out from behind the desk and approached him slowly, her expression gentle. The closer she got, the more she could see how small he was, his shoulders hunched and thin, his clothes slightly too big, worn and frayed at the edges. She could see that he was scared, yet there was a resilience in his eyes, an almost defiant strength, as if he were daring anyone to question his right to be here. She knelt down to his level, softening her voice. "Hi there, sweetheart. My name's Emma. Are you all right?" The boy tightened his hold on the baby in his arms, shifting slightly as if unsure whether he could trust her. His gaze flickered from Emma to the empty waiting room, then back to Emma. Finally, after a long moment of silence, he whispered, "This is Sammy, my brother." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but Emma could hear the raw emotion in his words. "I've been taking care of him. We don't have anywhere else to go." Emma's heart broke a little at his words. She kept her face calm, though, careful not to let her worry show. She sensed that any sign of pity would make him retreat further. Instead, she kept her tone gentle, steady. "Well, I'm so glad you came here, Ethan. That's your name, right?" He nodded, still hesitant. She noticed how his eyes shifted protectively down to the baby in his arms. Sammy, as he called him, was tiny, likely only a few months old by Emma's guess. She took in the frailty of the baby, the way his little face was tucked into Ethan's shoulder, completely unaware of the world outside. Emma could see that the older brother had been carrying this weight on his own for too long. "You're safe here, Ethan. Both of you are safe here," she said, her voice warm, inviting, as if the simple act of saying it could make it true. She extended her hand gently, though not quite touching, just in case he pulled back. "You can trust us. We're here to help." Ethan's gaze flickered to her hand, but he didn't reach out. He hesitated, his body tense, his expression a mixture of determination and doubt. But the exhaustion in his eyes told a different story. He was tired of carrying it all alone, tired of running. He looked down at Sammy, who squirmed a bit in his sleep, but settled as soon as Ethan adjusted his hold. He whispered, almost as if he were afraid to admit it out loud, "He's all I have now." Emma felt her chest tighten. There was something in the way he held Sammy, like the boy was carrying not just his baby brother, but the weight of a promise, of something he didn't yet know how to fulfill. And in the silence that followed, Emma could see the story he wasn't telling, the unanswered questions in his tired eyes, the secrets he was still keeping. "Ethan," she began gently, "we're here to make sure you both get the care you need. And I promise, no one is going to take Sammy away from you." She spoke with certainty, knowing he needed to hear it said firmly, a pledge of loyalty from one human to another. "Can you tell me how long it's been, sweetheart? How long you've been taking care of Sammy on your own?" He was silent, his face unreadable, but after a long pause he murmured, "Since last week. I didn't know where else to go." Emma's mind raced. A boy so young, carrying a baby on his own for days, through who knows what hardship, protecting his brother against a world that had likely shown him little kindness. She fought to keep her voice steady, to keep from showing the sorrow and anger building inside her. "You did so well coming here, Ethan. You did exactly what you needed to do." His gaze softened for the briefest moment, as if a sliver of trust was beginning to take root. Promise you won't take him from me? His voice wavered, barely above a whisper. The strength he'd clung to was slipping, leaving a boy desperate for reassurance. Emma placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and warm. I promise, Ethan. We're here to help you both, and that means keeping you together as best we can. Ethan nodded, a faint relief flickering across his face. He let out a shaky breath, his grip on Sammy loosening just a bit, enough to let Emma glimpse the vulnerability he'd been holding back. He looked around the hospital, his eyes wary but no longer panicked. For the first time, he allowed himself to look around, as if maybe this place, just maybe, could offer him the safety he'd been searching for. Emma felt a deep, protective instinct awaken in her. She could see that this boy had weathered more than any child his age should ever face, yet here he was, doing everything in his power to keep his brother safe. The fierce determination in his eyes mirrored something she'd seen in herself once, a long time ago. Come with me, Ethan, she said gently. Let's find somewhere warm and quiet for you and Sammy, okay? Somewhere you can rest. Ethan hesitated, glancing down at his brother one more time before nodding. Emma guided him slowly, leading him through the quiet hallways of the hospital. She noticed how he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if still afraid someone might try to take Sammy from him. She wanted to tell him that those fears were over now, that no one here would betray him, but she knew words would take time to sink in. Finally, they reached a small examination room with soft lighting, far from the bustling main hallway. Emma opened the door and Ethan stepped inside, his eyes darting around cautiously. She turned on a small lamp, casting a gentle glow over the room. You can sit here, she said, gesturing to a padded chair by the bed. Just a place for you to catch your breath. Ethan settled down, pulling Sammy close, the weight of his exhaustion evident as he sank into the chair. Sammy let out a small sound, stirring briefly before nuzzling into Ethan's shoulder, his tiny hands curling into fists. Emma smiled, watching the way Ethan instinctively adjusted, the way he seemed to know just how to soothe his baby brother. As she looked at the two of them, Emma felt a surge of admiration. Here was a boy who had taken on the role of protector, who had risked everything to keep his brother safe. She could feel the story in his silence, the weight of all he hadn't said, but for now, she was content to let that story unfold in its own time. Right now, what mattered was making him feel safe. Thank you, Ethan whispered, his voice soft, his eyes drooping as if sleep were finally winning. For the first time since he'd stepped into the hospital, he looked like a child again, tired, vulnerable, yet wrapped in a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found a place to rest. Ethan sat in the hospital room, clutching Sammy close as Nurse Emma finished checking Sammy's vitals. She'd given Ethan a fresh set of clothes and a small cot beside Sammy's crib. After the initial questions about his well-being, Emma had called Dr. Collins, the hospital's trusted pediatrician, knowing he'd handle Ethan's situation with care. Dr. Collins stepped into the room, bringing a comforting energy as he offered Ethan a warm smile. Hi, Ethan, Dr. Collins began, settling into a chair across from him. I understand you've been through a lot. We just want to make sure you're both all right. Ethan looked away, focusing on Sammy. The baby was fast asleep, his tiny hand curled around Ethan's thumb. He'd been careful not to reveal too much, keeping his answers short. His trust was still tightly guarded, even with Nurse Emma and Dr. Collins' gentle approach. But Emma sensed his exhaustion, the kind that went beyond sleepless nights. She sat beside him, her voice soft, encouraging. Ethan, you've done an incredible job taking care of Sammy. I can see how much you love him. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. After a long silence, he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. He's all I have left. I promised I'd take care of him. Emma's heart ached at the weight in his words. She leaned in, nodding gently. Did your mom ask you to take care of Sammy? Ethan's face fell, his eyes clouding over. He hesitated before nodding, staring at his hands. It was the last thing she told me, to take care of him. I didn't want to leave, but I couldn't stay with him. Where were you staying, Ethan? Dr. Collins asked gently. A shadow crossed Ethan's face. He closed his eyes, shoulders tensing. We were with my uncle after she passed. I thought he'd help, but he didn't want us there. He didn't care about Sammy or me. Ethan's voice broke. He said we were just a burden, and he made sure we knew it. Emma felt a surge of protectiveness. She reached out, her hand gently touching his shoulder. You don't have to go back there, Ethan. We'll make sure of it. Ethan's eyes met hers, brimming with unshed tears. He quickly looked down, his voice shaking. I tried to stay. I really did. But he wouldn't feed us, wouldn't let us sleep. He said Sammy cried too much, that it was my fault I couldn't keep him quiet. His face twisted with guilt. I tried my best. I really did. Oh, Ethan, Emma murmured, moved by his pain. You've done so much already. It's not your fault, any of this. You're so brave for protecting Sammy the way you have. But Ethan shook his head, the familiar ache of responsibility pressing down on him. I can't lose him. He's all I have, I promised her. Dr. Collins, watching Ethan's internal battle, spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. Ethan, keeping you together is important to us too. No one here wants to separate you from Sammy, but there are people who care about you, who can help you both. Would you let us try? Ethan was silent, his mind swimming with doubt. He wanted to believe them, but every part of him braced against the idea of letting anyone else help. Trusting someone with Sammy's care was like letting go of his last connection to his mother. But he was tired, so very tired. As if sensing his conflict, Emma leaned closer. Ethan, you remind me of another boy I met years ago. He was a bit older than you, but he was looking after his sister too. We helped them, and they're both doing so well now. They're still together, and both of them got to be kids again. That's all we want for you and Sammy too. Ethan's expression softened a little. He let out a small sigh, loosening his grip on Sammy. It's just, I don't know how to be a kid anymore, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Emma and Dr. Collins exchanged a glance. It was clear that Ethan had been living in survival mode, protecting Sammy and shielding himself from a world that had shown little kindness. They wanted to give him the freedom to be a child again, but they'd have to earn his trust first. Over the next few days, the hospital team rallied to make Ethan and Sammy comfortable. Nurse Emma brought blankets, food, and toys, making sure Ethan felt a sense of stability. She noticed that he always kept Sammy close, even as he began to relax into the hospital's routine. She admired the way he tended to his brother, feeding him, adjusting his blankets, whispering soft lullabies to calm him. Emma would sit beside him during these quiet moments, sometimes sharing stories of children the hospital had helped. She'd talk about families who had taken children in, providing safe, loving homes, until their parents could return, or until more permanent arrangements were found. Slowly, Ethan began to trust her more. One day, Emma mentioned a local foster family, the Rileys. They're wonderful people, she told Ethan. They've taken care of siblings before, and they understand how important it is to keep brothers and sisters together. Ethan's brow furrowed. Would they keep Sammy and me? Emma nodded, watching his expression. They would. And you could still be there to watch over him, to make sure he's safe. The Rileys would just be there to help, so you wouldn't have to do it all alone. Ethan was silent, a mixture of hope and fear playing across his face. I don't know, he whispered, glancing down at Sammy. What if they don't really want us? What if they say we're too much trouble? Emma placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You are anything but trouble, Ethan, and anyone would be lucky to have you and Sammy in their lives. But you don't have to decide right now. We'll take things one step at a time, together. That night, after hours of quietly mulling over Emma's words, Ethan finally let his guard down. As the hospital hummed with late-night quiet, he whispered to Nurse Emma, who was on night duty nearby. I miss her so much. My mom, she was all we had. She used to say Sammy would be my little shadow. I promised her I'd keep him safe, and now I'm scared I'll mess it up. His voice cracked, the heavy burden of grief and responsibility breaking through. Emma moved closer, her voice low and comforting. Ethan, you've done more than most people your age could even imagine, and you haven't let Sammy down. You've given him a chance just by bringing him here." Ethan's shoulders shook as he quietly sobbed, finally releasing the emotions he'd been holding in. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," he whispered, his face buried in his hands. Emma wrapped her arm around him gently, letting him cry. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Ethan. That's why we're here. That's why people like the Rileys are here. You've been strong for Sammy, and now it's time to let someone else help carry that weight." Ethan took a deep, shuddering breath, his exhaustion giving way to a fragile sense of hope. In that moment, he realized that perhaps he didn't have to carry everything on his own. Perhaps there was a world beyond his uncle's abuse, a world where he and Sammy could be safe, together, and maybe even happy. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely leaving his lips, but they were filled with gratitude and relief. Emma smiled softly, brushing a hand through his hair. "You're very welcome, Ethan, and I'll be here as long as you need me. You don't have to face any of this alone." For the first time since his arrival, Ethan felt a sliver of peace. He closed his eyes, still holding Sammy, but for once he didn't feel the need to keep watch. He was safe, if only for a moment, and in the quiet of that hospital room, he began to believe that he and Sammy might have a future beyond mere survival. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the small window, casting a soft warmth over the room. Ethan opened his eyes to find Nurse Emma sitting nearby, a comforting presence that he was starting to rely on more than he'd realized. Sammy stirred in his sleep, his tiny hands stretching, his face peaceful. Ethan brushed a gentle finger over Sammy's cheek, his heart full of emotions he couldn't yet name. Nurse Emma leaned over, her voice soft. "How are you feeling, Ethan? Did you get some rest?" Ethan nodded slowly. "A little," he said, his voice still hushed with the weight of yesterday's emotions. Emma reached for a small tray beside her. "We've got breakfast here for you and Sammy. Thought you both might be hungry." She offered him a plate with warm oatmeal, a cup of juice, and a bottle of formula for Sammy. Ethan accepted the food gratefully, trying not to show how hungry he was. He'd been surviving on scraps and whatever he could find for the past week, so this felt like a luxury. As he fed Sammy, he looked up at Nurse Emma, his eyes showing the faintest glimmer of hope. "Is it true, what you said about the Rileys?" he asked. "That they'd take both of us?" Emma's expression softened. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Yes, Ethan. They've taken in siblings before, and they're eager to meet you and Sammy. They know how important it is to keep you together." Ethan looked down, chewing his lip thoughtfully. Part of him was still scared, still holding on to the thought that any moment things could go wrong. But another part of him, the part that was slowly beginning to trust, wanted to believe her. Dr. Collins came in just then, offering Ethan a warm smile as he joined them. "Good morning, Ethan. I hear Nurse Emma's been telling you about the Rileys." Ethan nodded, his voice cautious. "She says they might want both of us." Dr. Collins nodded. "That's right. They're very kind people, and they're just waiting for the right time to meet you. They understand that Sammy is important to you, and they're ready to make sure he's safe and loved." Ethan's fingers fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, his mind racing. It all sounded so impossible. After so long feeling alone, the thought of people caring about him and Sammy felt surreal. Do I have to decide right away?" he asked, his voice small. Emma smiled, shaking her head. "No, Ethan. We're not in a rush. Take all the time you need to feel comfortable." Ethan nodded, feeling the first real flicker of control over his life that he'd had in a long time. For so long, everything had felt out of his hands, dictated by the harshness of his uncle and the uncertainty of each day. Now, for the first time, he felt like he had a say in his own future. The next few days passed in a gentle rhythm. Nurses came by with toys and clothes for Sammy, giving Ethan space to adjust to this new environment. One of the nurses brought a small, soft blanket for Sammy, embroidered with his name, while another gifted Ethan a book about animals, explaining that it might help Sammy one day too. Ethan found himself settling into a routine, watching over Sammy as he slept in his crib, sometimes reading aloud from the book to soothe him. Every time someone from the hospital staff came by, they did so with kindness and patience, never pressing him to make any decisions he wasn't ready for. Gradually, Ethan felt the weight on his shoulders ease just a little. Each day, bringing with it a growing sense of stability and the quiet, cautious hope that he and Sammy might finally have a chance at a better life. Ethan began to open up more, sharing small snippets of his life with Nurse Emma during quiet moments. He told her about his mother's love for music, how she would hum to Sammy at night, and how she'd made him promise to look after Sammy no matter what. Emma listened closely, offering words of comfort and admiration. "You've done so well, Ethan," she said one evening, watching as he rocked Sammy in his arms. "You've taken on so much more than anyone your age should have to, and you've done it with so much strength. Your mother would be incredibly proud of you." A lump rose in Ethan's throat. The praise was almost too much to bear, stirring up memories he tried to bury. But Emma's words also brought a sense of relief, like the weight of his mother's final wish was being shared by someone who understood. One night, after everyone had left, Ethan sat by Sammy's crib, his thoughts drifting to the Rileys and what it might mean to live with them. He still felt torn. Sammy was his responsibility, the promise he'd made to his mother. But there was a part of him, a small but growing part, that yearned for the kind of support Nurse Emma spoke of. A chance to be a kid again without carrying the world on his shoulders. When Nurse Emma came by for her night check, she noticed his faraway look. She sat beside him, waiting quietly until he was ready to speak. "Emma, if I go with the Rileys, do you think Sammy will remember me?" His voice was so soft, almost a whisper, as he finally put voice to his deepest fear. Emma took his hand, her voice full of conviction. "Of course he will, Ethan. You're his big brother. He'll always remember you, and you'll still be a part of his life. The Rileys want to make sure you two stay together as much as possible, just with a little extra support." Ethan nodded, his fears quieted, if only for a moment. The thought of Sammy growing up with people who cared about him, people who could provide what Ethan struggled to give, filled him with both relief and sadness. But mostly, it brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. As the days passed, Ethan gradually grew closer to the idea of meeting the Rileys. They visited the hospital one morning, bringing soft toys and a picture book for Sammy. They spoke to Ethan with warmth and patience, explaining that they'd be there to support both him and Sammy as long as they needed. Ethan, though still cautious, allowed himself to smile a little as he watched them interact with Sammy. The Rileys spoke gently to Sammy, their voices soft and caring, and Sammy responded with small coos and curious glances. It felt strange to watch someone else cradle his brother, but it didn't feel wrong. In fact, for the first time in a long while, it felt right. In that moment, Ethan felt the smallest seed of hope. Perhaps he could finally share the weight he'd carried for so long. Perhaps, in the gentle embrace of this new family, he and Sammy could both find something he hadn't dared to imagine, a safe place to simply be. After the Rileys left, Dr. Collins and Nurse Emma sat with Ethan discussing the next steps. Ethan listened carefully, nodding as they outlined what life with the Rileys might look like. A life with a real bed, a routine, and people who would always look out for him and Sammy. He'd be able to go to school, to play, to sleep soundly, knowing his brother was safe. That night, lying in the small cot beside Sammy's crib, Ethan thought about all he'd heard. He felt a mixture of emotions, fear, hope, and something he hadn't felt in so long that it almost startled him, excitement. The thought of a life beyond survival, of living somewhere he could finally feel safe, began to take root in his heart. He reached over and touched Sammy's tiny hand, whispering, "We're going to be okay, little guy. We're going to be okay." In the quiet of the hospital room, Ethan closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to rest. He didn't have all the answers, but he was no longer carrying the burden alone. Emma and Dr. Collins, the nurses, and now the Rileys, they were all there, holding him up, each one helping him to believe that a brighter future was possible. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe in the promise of tomorrow, a world where he and Sammy could be safe, together, and loved. The following morning, Ethan woke to find Nurse Emma sitting by Sammy's crib, gently rocking him as he babbled and reached for her fingers. Her gaze softened as she noticed Ethan stirring, and she smiled. "Morning, Ethan. Sammy's been trying to get everyone's attention already." Ethan sat up, rubbing his eyes and watching as Sammy held on tightly to Nurse Emma's fingers. The baby's face was lit up with a wide grin, eyes crinkling as he cooed and babbled. Seeing Sammy so happy eased a small part of the ever-present worry in Ethan's chest. Dr. Collins soon entered the room, bringing Ethan a breakfast tray and pulling up a chair beside the bed. "How'd you sleep?" he asked gently. Ethan hesitated. "Better than usual," he admitted, though he kept his tone cautious. "I didn't wake up so much. Just listen to Sammy breathe." Dr. Collins nodded, understanding the unspoken fears behind Ethan's answer. "You're used to keeping a close eye on him, aren't you? That's what good big brothers do." Ethan's face softened, and he looked down at his hands. "I don't want to mess this up. I've only got one job, and it's making sure Sammy's okay." Nurse Emma reached over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, you've done an amazing job. Sammy's lucky to have you. But remember, you don't have to do this alone. You have people who care about both of you now." Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze. He could feel the steady assurance in her words, the warmth of someone who truly understood what he had been carrying alone. For so long, he'd fought to keep himself and Sammy safe. But here, surrounded by people who genuinely cared, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight so hard anymore. With a small, grateful smile, he whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time, he felt what it might be like to truly belong. As if to emphasize her words, there was a soft knock on the door, and the Rileys entered, bringing a quiet warmth with them. They carried a small box of toys and a few new clothes for Sammy, along with a book they thought Ethan might enjoy. Mr. and Mrs. Riley, both in their late 40s, had calm, friendly faces and a soft-spoken demeanor that seemed to put Ethan at ease, even if he didn't fully trust them yet. "Good morning, Ethan," Mrs. Riley greeted with a gentle smile. "We thought we'd drop by, see how you and Sammy are doing." Ethan gave a small nod, glancing at the gifts they brought. It was strange, this kindness that came so freely, without any sign of resentment or annoyance. He was used to feeling like a burden, but somehow, here in this hospital room, he didn't feel that way at all. As Mrs. Riley cooed at Sammy and showed him a small, soft bear, Ethan watched with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. Collins noticed the tension in his gaze and gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "It's okay, Ethan. The Rileys know how much Sammy means to you. They just want to help both of you, so you don't have to do it all on your own." Ethan nodded, letting the words sink in. Part of him still worried that this was all too good to be true, that it could disappear in an instant. But as he watched the way Mrs. Riley held Sammy, he felt that flicker of hope he'd kept hidden for so long. Later that day, after the Rileys had left and the hospital had quieted, Nurse Emma brought a small scrapbook she'd made, filled with photos of Ethan and Sammy taken over the past few days. She handed it to him, her eyes warm and encouraging. "Here's something to remember this time," she said. "Just a little reminder that no matter where you go, you two are never alone." Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes lingering on each photo. There was one of him holding Sammy close, another of Sammy's tiny hand curled around his finger, and yet another of Nurse Emma smiling with Sammy in her arms. It was as though every moment of care, every bit of love and warmth he'd felt here, was captured in those images. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Emma nodded, understanding more than words could express. "You're so welcome, Ethan. And remember, wherever you end up, you're a part of this family now, too." Ethan looked at her, a hint of a smile breaking through. For so long, he'd believed that he and Sammy only had each other, that they were destined to face the world alone. But now, holding the scrapbook in his hands, he realized they'd found something he hadn't thought possible, a place where they belonged, where they were cared for and loved. He hugged the scrapbook tightly to his chest, feeling a warmth that chased away the last shadows of doubt. For the first time in a long, long while, He allowed himself to imagine a future where he and Sammy were safe, supported, and most of all, loved. The hospital team gathered that evening to bid Ethan and Sammy a heartfelt goodbye. Nurses who had taken care of them both came to say farewell, bringing small keepsakes and tokens of their care. Some handed Ethan handwritten notes of encouragement, while others brought extra blankets and toys for Sammy. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he hugged Nurse Emma, clinging to her for a moment longer than he intended. He whispered, "I'll never forget you, or this place." Nurse Emma pulled back, brushing a hand through his hair. "And we'll never forget you, Ethan. You and Sammy will always have a place in our hearts. Now go show the world what you're made of." Dr. Collins, with a mixture of pride and sorrow, shook Ethan's hand, clapping him on the shoulder as he said, "Take care of Sammy, but also take care of yourself. You deserve happiness too, Ethan." With a nod, Ethan took a deep breath, looking down at Sammy, who was asleep in his arms, wrapped in a blanket covered in little teddy bears. The weight of responsibility still pressed on him, but it felt lighter now, softened by the care and love he'd found in this unlikely place. As he walked out of the hospital and toward a new future with the Rileys, Ethan held Sammy close, a quiet promise settling in his heart. He'd find a way to honor his mother's memory, to give Sammy a life filled with warmth, kindness, and the stability he'd longed for. Together, they left behind the shadows of their past, stepping into a new beginning, carrying with them a family that wasn't bound by blood, but by heart, forever changed by the love they'd found in each other and in those who had cared enough to help them. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat of the Rileys' car, watching the hospital shrink in the distance, a place that had offered him more than just shelter. It had been a brief but intense refuge, a place where he'd learned it was okay to trust, to hope, and most of all, to believe that he and Sammy didn't have to face the world alone. Sammy, swaddled in his teddy bear blanket, dozed peacefully in Ethan's lap, his tiny mouth moving in little murmurs as he slept. Ethan leaned down, pressing his forehead gently against Sammy's, letting his brother's soft, warm breath soothe the flickers of anxiety that still stirred within him. There was a quiet reassurance in holding Sammy, a grounding reminder of his promise to protect him. It wasn't a responsibility he could ever give up, but somehow, with the Rileys nearby, the weight of it didn't feel so overwhelming. Mrs. Riley glanced at him in the rearview mirror, offering a kind smile. "How are you feeling back there, Ethan? Is Sammy comfortable?" Ethan looked up, surprised by her warmth, and managed a small smile. "Yeah, he's comfortable." He glanced down at Sammy, who seemed perfectly content in his arms, and felt a wave of quiet relief settle over him. Mr. Riley turned slightly, his voice gentle. "And how about you, Ethan? We're here to make sure you're comfortable too." Ethan hesitated, but seeing the genuine care in their eyes, he nodded. I'm okay." The words felt unfamiliar on his tongue, like something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. But here, in the safety of the car with the Rileys, he realized that maybe he really was okay. As they drove toward their new home, Ethan allowed himself to lean back, still holding Sammy close. The future felt unknown and a little scary, but for the first time, it also felt full of possibilities. With Sammy nestled in his arms and the Rileys by his side, he felt a warmth blooming in his chest, hope finally taking root. Ethan looked up, nodding a little shyly. "Yeah, he's good. He's been sleeping a lot since we got here." Mrs. Riley's smile softened. "That's a good thing. I'm sure it's because he knows he's safe with his big brother. You're doing an amazing job, Ethan." Her words touched something deep within him. He still felt wary, not quite ready to let his guard down completely, but he wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe he could finally rest, if only for a little while, and that Sammy was indeed safe. As they drove, Mr. Riley talked softly about the town they'd be living in. "It's a small community," he said, "but there are lots of kids your age nearby, and there's a great school, lots of open fields and parks for playing, if you're interested, of course." Ethan nodded, his heart stirring at the mention of things he hadn't thought about in so long. School, friends, even the simple freedom of playing outside. It was strange to imagine himself doing those things again, like a normal kid, without the constant worry that had been his shadow for so long. When they finally pulled up to the Rileys' home, Ethan's eyes widened. It was a modest, cozy house with a sprawling garden in the back, where tall sunflowers swayed in the breeze, and a small set sat tucked beneath a tree. The sight of it brought a strange, comforting ache to his chest, a longing he hadn't let himself feel until now. Mr. Riley turned to him with a smile. "Welcome home, Ethan." The words felt surreal. Ethan stepped out of the car, still cradling Sammy, and took in the scene around him. He felt a tug at his heart as Mrs. Riley led him through the front door, which opened into a warm living room filled with soft rugs, colorful throw blankets, and framed family photos lining the walls. There was an atmosphere here that felt steady, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Mrs. Riley placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him gently down the hallway. "Let me show you where you and Sammy will be staying." They reached a small, sunlit room decorated in soft blues and greens. There was a crib for Sammy, lined with a soft blanket and a mobile of stars and clouds hanging above it. Beside it was a single bed, neatly made, with a small teddy bear placed on the pillow. "This is for me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a space of his own that felt so calm, so welcoming. Mrs. Riley nodded, her smile warm and understanding. "Yes, Ethan, for you and Sammy. We thought you might like your own little spot, somewhere you can feel comfortable." Ethan felt his chest tighten as he took it all in. The crib ready for Sammy, the bed just for him, and the little teddy bear that felt like a small, quiet invitation to let down his guard. This room was more than just a space. It was a promise, a glimpse of the life they were offering him and Sammy. He gently placed Sammy in the crib, watching as his brother settled in, breathing softly beneath the mobile that turned slowly in the sunlight. Then he sat on the edge of his own bed, feeling the softness of the mattress, the warmth of the blankets. For the first time, he allowed himself to sink into it, to feel the comfort and safety this home promised. Mrs. Riley stayed by the doorway, giving him space but offering a gentle, encouraging smile. "Take your time, Ethan. This is your home now. You and Sammy are safe here." As he sat there, Ethan felt the weight of his past slowly lift, replaced by a sense of belonging he'd never known. He reached out to touch the teddy bear on his pillow, feeling its soft fur beneath his fingers. And as he looked around the room, he realized that, for the first time, he could see a future, a place where he and Sammy could grow, where they could just be kids, safe and loved. With a deep, shuddering breath, he let himself believe it. He was home. Ethan felt his eyes sting as he looked around the room. The quiet simplicity of it all, the bed, the crib, the soft colors, felt like an invitation to let down the walls he'd been carrying for so long. He walked over to the crib and gently placed Sammy inside, watching as his little brother stirred before settling into a deeper sleep. As Ethan stood there, Mrs. Riley reached over and handed him the small teddy bear from the bed. "This was one of our son's favorites," she said softly. "We thought you might like it here, something to keep you company." He clutched the bear to his chest, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't known he was missing. "Thank you." "Really, thank you," he managed, the words thick with emotion. Mrs. Riley gave him a gentle nod, understanding in her gaze. "You don't need to thank us, Ethan. We're just so glad to have you here." That first night, Ethan lay in his new bed, Sammy asleep in the crib beside him. He listened to the soft hum of the house around him, the way the walls seemed to breathe with a quiet peace that was almost unfamiliar. He kept the teddy bear close, one hand resting on the crib rail, his fingers lightly brushing Sammy's tiny hand as he drifted to sleep. For the first time in what felt like forever, he closed his eyes without the weight of worry pressing down on him. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself slowly adapting to this new life. The Rileys were gentle and patient, giving him space to adjust while always making sure he knew he was cared for. They invited him to help with small tasks around the house, things like setting the table or watering the sunflowers in the garden. Little by little, he began to let his guard down, allowing himself to feel a quiet kind of joy in these ordinary moments. One evening, as they were sitting together after dinner, Mrs. Riley brought out the scrapbook Nurse Emma had given Ethan at the hospital. She gently placed it on the table, a soft smile on her face. "Emma called earlier," she said, "just to check in on you. She told me she hopes you're settling in well." Ethan nodded, feeling a pang of warmth at the mention of Emma. He flipped through the scrapbook, looking at the photos of himself with Sammy, of Nurse Emma smiling beside them, of Dr. Collins checking on Sammy with a gentle hand. Each image felt like a piece of his journey, a reminder of the people who had cared enough to help him and Sammy find their way. Can I call her sometime?" he asked, his voice small, uncertain. Mrs. Riley's smile widened. "Of course, Ethan. You can call her whenever you like. She'd love to hear from you." Ethan felt a sense of relief, knowing he could stay connected to the people who had been there for him when he and Sammy needed it most. Later that night, as he lay in bed with the teddy bear tucked under his arm, he felt an unexpected sense of peace. For so long, he'd worried that he and Sammy would always be alone, always fighting to survive. But now, surrounded by warmth and stability, he allowed himself to believe in something new, a future where he didn't have to carry everything on his own. As he closed his eyes, he knew he was still the protector, still Sammy's big brother, but he was also something he hadn't allowed himself to be in a long time. A child who could sleep soundly, knowing that he too was safe and loved. With the scrapbook in his lap, Ethan looked around the room, taking in the quiet warmth, the sense of safety he was starting to recognize as something real. For so long, he'd lived in fear, always looking over his shoulder, always bracing himself against the harshness of the world. But here, in this place with the Rileys, he was beginning to understand what it meant to be cared for, to be allowed to grow, to just be a kid. That night, as he settled into bed, Sammy's soft breathing beside him, Ethan closed his eyes with a smile, finally daring to let himself dream of a future where he and Sammy could thrive. He didn't know what the road ahead would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. They had people who loved them, people who would stand by them no matter what. And for Ethan, that was all he needed. In the days to come, he would reach out to Nurse Emma, sharing stories of his new life, of Sammy's first words, and his own adventures in the garden. He'd tell her about the sunflowers he helped water each morning, the laughter shared over family dinners, and the quiet nights where he felt at peace. And with each call, each letter, he would carry with him the knowledge that he and Sammy were surrounded by a family not bound by blood, but by love. A love that had brought them through the darkest of times and into a future full of hope. Ethan knew that, together, they had finally found the place they'd been searching for all along, a true home. Ethan sat beside Sammy in the social worker's office, clutching his brother's hand while glancing nervously at the couple seated across from them. Mr. and Mrs. Riley were warm and kind, with gentle smiles that seemed to ease some of the tension in Ethan's chest. They asked him questions about Sammy's favorite things and listened closely to his answers, making it clear that they understood how much Sammy meant to him. "We want you to know, Ethan," Mrs. Riley said gently, "that you're both welcome in our home. Sammy will be safe and loved, and so will you. And if there's ever a time you want to spend time with him, he'll be right there, waiting." Ethan's heart felt a mix of relief and lingering doubt. He'd spent so much time protecting Sammy on his own, and the thought of trusting someone else felt foreign, even frightening. But the Rileys' calm reassurances and their promise to let him stay connected to Sammy softened the edges of his fear. As they left the office, Nurse Emma was waiting outside, her face lighting up with a smile as she saw Ethan. In her hand, she held a small pendant on a chain. She held it out to him, her voice soft and warm. "This was your mother's," she said. "It's a small token, but I thought you might like to keep it close. It's a reminder that you're carrying her love with you, always." Ethan took the pendant, feeling the cool metal in his hand. It was simple, engraved with a small heart. He swallowed, looking up at Emma with a gratitude that words couldn't fully express. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, for everything. Emma knelt down, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've done so well, Ethan. Your mom would be so proud of you. But remember, it's okay to let others help now. You don't have to do this alone. As he nodded, Ethan felt a bittersweet sense of relief, as if a burden was finally being lifted. Holding the pendant tight, he let Emma pull him into a soft, final hug. It was a quiet moment of closure, filled with unspoken promises that no matter where he went, he would always carry this part of his journey with him. Before leaving, Ethan took one last look at Emma and Dr. Collins, his heart swelling with gratitude for all they'd done. He promised them, and himself, that he would make the most of this new beginning, both for Sammy and for himself. The Rileys guided Ethan and Sammy into their car, the road ahead full of unknowns, but also, for the first time in a long time, a sense of hope. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the pendant against his chest. He wasn't just leaving with Sammy. He was leaving with the love and resilience passed down to him, carrying his family forward into a brighter future. As the car pulled away from the hospital, Ethan stared out the window, watching the familiar building fade into the distance. He felt the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him, the worry, the fear, and, finally, the unexpected kindness he'd found in people like Nurse Emma and Dr. Collins. He wrapped his fingers around the pendant, feeling its solid, comforting weight against his chest, a reminder that his mother's love was with him wherever he went. Beside him, Sammy stirred, reaching a tiny hand toward Ethan, who immediately reached out, letting Sammy's fingers wrap around his own. The warmth of his little brother's touch anchored him, giving him the strength he needed as he faced this new life with the Rileys. Mrs. Riley glanced at him from the front seat, her voice gentle. "We've set up a room for both of you, so you'll be close to Sammy at night," she said. "And we thought you might like to pick out some things for your room later this week, so you can make it feel like yours." Ethan gave a small nod, surprised by the kindness in her words. He'd never had the chance to choose things for himself before. The thought of having a space that was truly his, a place he could call home, felt strange, almost like a dream he didn't quite trust yet. When they arrived at the Rileys' house, Ethan felt his breath catch. It was a cozy, welcoming home with a swing in the front yard and flower beds blooming with bright, cheerful colors. Inside, the rooms were warm and inviting, filled with soft light and gentle colors that seemed to whisper of peace and safety. Mrs. Riley led them to their room, a space with 2 beds side by side, one for him and a crib for Sammy, placed close enough that Ethan could reach over and hold his hand if he needed to. On the bed was a soft blanket with stars stitched into the fabric, along with a teddy bear propped up against the pillow. "It's not much," Mr. Riley said quietly, "but we hope it feels like home." Ethan could barely find the words to answer. He felt a lump in his throat as he walked over to the crib, gently placing Sammy inside. His little brother squirmed for a moment before settling, his tiny face peaceful and content. Ethan stroked Sammy's cheek, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and something he hadn't dared to feel for a long time: hope. That night, as he lay in bed beside Sammy's crib, Ethan found himself gazing up at the ceiling, tracing the faint shadows cast by the moonlight filtering through the window. The room was quiet, the house still, but unlike the stillness of his old life, this silence felt safe, like a blanket gently wrapping around him. The constant, gnawing worry that had once kept him awake felt distant, replaced by a soft reassurance that they were finally where they belonged. In the days that followed, Ethan began to settle into a new routine with the Rileys. They encouraged him to join them for meals, to help with small chores around the house, and even to spend some time outside, just playing and exploring. He began to learn what it felt like to be a kid again, free from the burdens that had once weighed him down. There were moments when the old anxieties would resurface, brief flashes of worry about whether this happiness could truly last. But each time, Mr. and Mrs. Riley were there with gentle words and open arms, reminding him that he and Sammy were safe, loved, and valued. One afternoon, as Ethan played in the yard while Sammy napped inside, he felt an unfamiliar lightness. He ran through the grass, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, his laughter carried by the breeze. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward a future he could believe in. With each passing day, the weight of the past lifted a little more. Ethan began to understand that he and Sammy had found more than a home. They had found a family, one that cherished them and allowed him to dream again. Holding on to the pendant, he whispered to himself, "We're going to be okay." And this time, he truly believed it. One afternoon, as he sat with Mrs. Riley on the porch, watching Sammy crawl on the blanket they'd spread on the grass, she turned to him with a smile. "You know, Ethan, you're doing an incredible job. Sammy is lucky to have you." Ethan looked down, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. I want to be there for him," he replied softly. "He's all I have." Mrs. Riley placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice full of kindness. "You have us too, Ethan. And no matter what, you'll always be part of his life. You're both part of our family now." The words settled into him like seeds, taking root in a place he hadn't even known was empty. It wasn't just a house or a bed or even the meals. They were offering him a sense of belonging, a chance to be part of something he could trust. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself reaching out to Nurse Emma, sending her small notes and drawings that the Rileys helped him mail. She wrote back each time, sharing little stories from the hospital and asking about Sammy's milestones, which Ethan eagerly shared. It felt good to know that she was still there, still cheering him on, a steady reminder of the love that had brought him to this place. One night, as Ethan was tucking Sammy into his crib, he glanced down at the pendant around his neck. He felt a swell of gratitude, his heart full as he held Sammy's tiny hand. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that, for the first time, it felt bright, filled with the promise of a life he hadn't dared to dream of. Leaning down, he whispered, "We're going to be okay, Sammy. Mom would be proud of us." And in the quiet of that room, surrounded by the love of a family he'd found in the most unexpected way, Ethan felt a deep, unshakable peace that would carry him forward, guiding him through whatever lay ahead. He was home. And he and Sammy were safe together, ready to build a future full of hope, surrounded by the family they'd been waiting for all along. As weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself growing in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Life with the Rileys settled into a comfortable routine, one filled with laughter, warmth, and the steady rhythm of a real home. Ethan learned the joy of simple moments, like breakfast around the kitchen table, the sound of Sammy's giggles as Mr. Riley lifted him high into the air, and the evenings when he and Mrs. Riley would water the flowers in the garden, her gentle encouragement reminding him that he was safe, wanted, and cherished. He began school that autumn, his first experience in a classroom since everything had changed. At first, the idea had terrified him. He'd clung to Sammy the night before, voicing his worries to Mrs. Riley, who had sat with him, listening with the patience he was coming to count on. She reassured him that Sammy would be safe, well cared for, with Mrs. Riley herself staying close by, ready to step in if anything happened. And so, with a mixture of fear and courage, he went to school, navigating a world that felt both unfamiliar and exhilarating. The teachers were kind, and a few classmates slowly warmed up to him, inviting him to play during recess and sharing their lunches. By the second month, he was laughing along with them, running across the playground, a boy who was finally allowed to be a child. Ethan's life was filled with milestones he hadn't anticipated. His first spelling test, his first school friend, his first autumn field trip. Each step brought him closer to a version of himself he had barely imagined, one unburdened, happy, and full of wonder for the world around him. At night, after he'd tucked Sammy in, he'd sometimes sit by the window, looking out over the garden bathed in moonlight, the pendant resting against his heart. In those quiet moments, he'd think about how far they'd come, from the fearful days of wondering if they'd ever find a place to call home to now, living in the security of this newfound family. For the first time, he could see a future for both himself and Sammy, one filled not just with survival, but with the promise of dreams, joy, and love. And so each day, with the Rileys by his side and Sammy's laughter as his anchor, Ethan continued to grow, finding strength and happiness in the warmth of the family that had welcomed him. The ache of his past softened into a memory that he carried gently, no longer a weight, but a reminder of how far they had come. He knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, with a heart full of hope and a place they could finally, truly call home. But the greatest joy came each day when he'd return home to find Sammy waiting for him, his little arms reaching up in excitement. Ethan would scoop his brother into his arms, holding him close, feeling the kind of happiness he'd once thought was lost to him. The Rileys continued to honor Ethan's role as Sammy's brother, encouraging the bond they shared while also showing him that they too were there for both of them. There were still nights when Ethan would wake in a cold sweat, the memories of his past creeping into his dreams. But on those nights, he would reach for the pendant around his neck, feel the warmth of his new home surrounding him, and slowly, the nightmares would fade, replaced by the gentle reassurance of the life he was building here. As Thanksgiving approached, the Rileys invited Nurse Emma and Dr. Collins to join them for dinner, knowing how much they meant to Ethan. The reunion was filled with laughter, gratitude, and quiet moments where words weren't needed. Ethan hugged Emma tightly, feeling the familiar comfort of her embrace and the strength she had once lent him during his hardest days. "You're growing up so well, Ethan," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "And look at Sammy. He's thriving too, thanks to his big brother." Ethan's face flushed with pride, glancing over at Sammy, who was babbling happily in Mrs. Riley's lap. "It's not just me," he said. "It's because of all of you, because of everything you've done for us." Emma's eyes glistened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're all so proud of you, Ethan. Your mom would be too." As the evening drew to a close, they gathered around the table, voices mingling with the soft clinks of silverware, stories and laughter filling the room. The past was still there, a part of Ethan that would never fully disappear, but it no longer felt like a weight. It was a chapter he had lived, a chapter that had led him to this moment surrounded by people who loved him. The days passed with a gentle rhythm, each one building on the last, until it became impossible for Ethan to imagine life any other way. Winter came, and with it, the joys of Christmas. Ethan helped decorate the tree, hanging ornaments alongside Sammy's curious gaze as he tugged at the ribbons and lights. Snow fell, blanketing the world outside, and for the first time, he didn't feel the cold as something to fear, but as something beautiful, something magical. On Christmas morning, the family gathered around the tree, each taking turns opening gifts and sharing hugs. When Ethan unwrapped a small box to find a picture frame with a photo of him and Sammy taken on their first day with the Rileys, he felt a swell of gratitude so deep it left him speechless. It was more than just a picture. It was a memory preserved, a reminder of the day his life had begun to change. With Sammy in his arms, Ethan gazed around the room at the faces of his family, the people who had shown him what love and safety could mean. He knew now that he and Sammy were no longer alone, that they were surrounded by a love that could carry them through whatever lay ahead. And as they watched the snow fall outside, nestled together in the warm glow of the Christmas tree, Ethan felt that the life he'd once dreamed of was finally his, more real and beautiful than he'd ever imagined. He was home. As the new year began, Ethan made a quiet promise to himself to embrace this life, to keep growing, and to always hold close the love that had guided him through his darkest days. He often thought of his mother, wondering if she could see him now, if she'd know that he had found safety, family, and a place where he and Sammy could thrive. And deep down, he felt a quiet assurance that she was proud, watching over them, her love woven into the family he had found here. One evening, as he tucked Sammy into bed, Ethan sat beside the crib, gently running his fingers through his brother's soft hair. He held the pendant around his neck, feeling its familiar warmth, the memory of his mother's voice as strong as ever. "We're okay now, Mom," he whispered. "I kept my promise. Sammy's safe. We're safe." He sat there for a while, just listening to Sammy's soft breathing, his heart full. This was home now, a place where he could dream, grow, and one day build a life of his own. The journey had been long and hard, but he'd made it, and now the future was bright, full of hope, love, and a family who would stand by him, come what may. With a deep, steadying breath, Ethan closed his eyes, letting peace settle over him. He knew the road hadn't been easy, and it wouldn't always be smooth, but he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. He had people beside him who cared, a little brother who looked up to him, and the memories of those who had given him strength to lean on. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, Ethan felt his mother's love within him, a constant reminder that he and Sammy would never walk this journey alone.